The key didn't fit. At first, I thought I had the wrong one. I stood there on the front porch, suitcase in one hand, purse sliding off my shoulder, staring at the brass lock like it had personally betrayed me. I tried again. Slowly. Carefully. The key slid halfway in and stopped with a dull metallic resistance. I pulled it out and examined it under the porch light. Same key. Same worn edge where the metal had been scraped years ago when Ethan accidentally dropped it in the driveway and ran it over with his car. I pushed it in again. Nothing. My stomach tightened. I knocked. No answer. Inside, I could see the faint glow of the living room lamp through the curtains. The same lamp I had left on before flying to Seattle 3 days earlier for a consulting project. I knocked again. Harder this time. Ethan? Still nothing. A car passed slowly down the street behind me. I could feel the driver glancing over, watching the strange scene of a woman standing outside her own home with luggage like she had shown up at the wrong address. My phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. My chest loosened for half a second until I read it. Ethan, you need to leave. This isn't your house anymore. For a moment, the words didn't process. I read them again. And again. The porch suddenly felt colder. I typed back. Me? What are you talking about? I'm literally standing outside. The typing dots appeared immediately. Then his reply came. Ethan, I changed the locks. I told you this was coming. I stared at the screen. No. He hadn't told me anything. Not directly. Not clearly. Not in a way that suggested I would come home from a work trip and be locked out of my own house like a stranger. I knocked again, this time louder. Ethan, open the door. The curtain shifted slightly. Just enough for me to see movement. He was inside. Watching. Then the door opened a few inches, held by the chain lock. Ethan leaned against the frame like this was mildly inconvenient for him. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Hey, he said casually. Like I had just come home from the grocery store. I stood there stunned. Why can't I get inside? He shrugged. I told you we needed space. You changed the locks. Yeah. His tone had that lazy indifference he used whenever he thought he was winning an argument. The porch light caught the side of his face and I noticed something strange. He was smiling slightly. Not happily. Confidently. Like someone who believed they had already secured the outcome. You can't lock me out of my own house, I said slowly. He tilted his head. Technically, he replied, it's my house. The words landed like a stone. I blinked. What? The deed's in my name, he said, almost bored. Remember? I felt my pulse in my ears. Of course I remembered. 5 years ago, when we bought this place. Ethan had insisted it was easier if the mortgage stayed under his credit profile because my consulting income fluctuated between contracts. At the time, it had sounded logical. Temporary. A practical decision between spouses. And I had trusted him. I looked past him into the living room. Our couch. Our photos. The hardwood floor we spent 3 weekends installing together. My voice came out quieter now. You're serious. He leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. Look, this doesn't have to be dramatic. Just grab your stuff tomorrow when I'm at work. My stuff? Yeah. I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Ethan, I said carefully, my clothes, my office, my files, everything I own is in there. He exhaled like I was exhausting him. Then come back later. The chain rattled as he started closing the door. Wait. He paused. I looked directly at him. You locked your wife out of her own home while she was on a business trip. He gave a small shrug. You'll figure something out. And then the door shut. The lock clicked. I stood there for several seconds, staring at the wood grain. The porch light hummed quietly above me. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Ethan. Ethan. Also, don't make this messy. It'll only make things worse for you. I read that line 3 times. Worse for me. The confidence in his voice earlier suddenly made sense. Ethan believed something very specific tonight. He believed he had control. He believed the paperwork favored him. He believed the house was his. And standing there on the porch with my suitcase beside me, I realized something else. Ethan had made a very big decision while I was away. A decision that assumed I had nothing left to say. Nothing left to show. Nothing left to prove. But as I slowly sat down on the top step and opened my phone again, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Because Ethan had changed the locks on the house. What he didn't realize was that the real door he had just opened was something much bigger. And by the time he understood that, it would already be far too late. I didn't knock again. Not that night. Instead, I sat on the porch for a few minutes longer, listening to the quiet hum of the streetlights and the distant sound of Ethan moving around inside the house like nothing unusual had happened. Like locking your wife out of her own home was a normal Thursday evening. Eventually, I stood up, pulled my suitcase down the steps, and walked to my car. The night air smelled faintly like rain. Early spring in this neighborhood always did. I placed the suitcase in the trunk, closed it gently, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel. Still. Calm. But inside my head, something old had started replaying. Because this wasn't the first time Ethan had underestimated me. Not even close. The truth is, Ethan had always believed he was the smarter one in our marriage. Not in a loud way. Not in an obvious way. But in the quiet, casual ways that slowly shape a relationship over time. Small comments. Little dismissals. The kind that seem harmless individually but form a pattern when you step back. Like the first time we talked about money. We were sitting in a coffee shop 6 years ago when I mentioned I was thinking about moving from freelance consulting into building a small analytics firm. Ethan laughed. Not cruelly. Just dismissively. You hate managing people, he said, stirring his coffee. I don't hate it. You avoid it. I remember smiling politely and changing the subject. At the time, I assumed he knew me well enough to be right. Later that year, when my contracts started growing and I mentioned possibly registering a company, he said something else. You're good at projects, he told me. But running a business is different. Again, not mean. Just certain. That quiet certainty became a familiar sound over the years. When my consulting rates increased. When I started traveling more for work. When my clients began requesting long-term contracts. Ethan always framed it the same way. You're lucky the market's good right now. Or sometimes. Just make sure you save while it lasts. He liked to remind me his job was stable. Predictable. Corporate. He worked as a regional operations manager for a retail chain. Good salary. Benefits. Predictable hours. And to Ethan, predictability meant superiority. Freelance income, to him, was temporary success. A phase. Not something that could outgrow his career. At least, that's what he believed. When we bought the house 5 years ago, that belief played a role too. We were sitting in a small office across from the mortgage officer. Stacks of documents on the desk. The woman glanced between our financial statements. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, "It'll probably be easier if the loan stays under my name." The officer nodded thoughtfully. "Your credit history is slightly longer." Ethan looked at me with that same confident smile. See? I remember hesitating. Not because I distrusted him, but because something about it felt uneven. You're still on everything else, he reassured me. Utilities, insurance, everything shared. It sounded reasonable. Practical. Marriage, after all, was supposed to mean trust. So I signed what needed signing. And life moved forward. For a while, things looked normal from the outside. Dinner parties. Weekend projects around the house. Trips when our schedules aligned. But quietly, something else was happening too. My consulting work didn't slow down. It expanded. What started as independent contracts slowly turned into long-term partnerships. Clients began asking for teams instead of individuals. Data systems instead of reports. Solutions instead of advice. And without making a big announcement about it, I started building something. At first it was just 2 analysts working remotely. Then 4. Then 8. I didn't call it a company at home. Not really. To Ethan, I still said things like client work and project deadlines. It was easier that way. Because every time I tried to explain the scale of it, he gave the same mild smile. That's great, he'd say. But his tone carried an unspoken translation. That's cute. 3 years ago, something else happened. Something Ethan barely noticed. I opened a separate business account, then a corporate registration, then an office lease in a small downtown building. None of it was secret. He just never asked. Ethan wasn't curious about things he believed he already understood. And he understood me as someone whose career would always orbit safely below his. So when I started traveling more frequently for contracts, he simply assumed I was chasing temporary opportunities, not building infrastructure, not signing multi-year agreements, and definitely not structuring ownership in ways that quietly changed the balance of everything. Which brings us back to the porch. Back to the night Ethan changed the locks. Sitting in my car across the street, I glanced once more at the house. Lights still on. Curtains still drawn. Inside, Ethan probably believed he had taken control of the situation. He believed the deed gave him power. He believed I had nowhere to go. No leverage. No strategy. Just a suitcase and a locked door. I finally started the engine. My phone lit up again with another message from him. Ethan, we'll talk tomorrow. Don't show up tonight again. I read the text, then placed the phone face down on the passenger seat. Because Ethan had misunderstood something fundamental about the last 5 years. He thought I had been working. What he didn't realize was that while he was busy assuming I depended on him, I had quietly been building something that made this entire house look very small. And tomorrow morning, he was going to discover just how wrong he had been. I didn't go to a hotel that night. Instead, I drove 15 minutes downtown and parked in front of a glass building Ethan had never stepped inside. Technically, he knew it existed. He had seen the address on a few shipping labels that arrived at the house over the years. But he had never asked what exactly was happening there. The lobby lights were still on when I walked in. The security guard behind the desk looked up and immediately nodded. Evening, Ms. Ashraf. Hi, Daniel. He glanced at my suitcase, but didn't ask questions. People who work night shifts in office buildings develop a respectful silence about other people's lives. Late flight, he asked casually. Something like that. He swiped his key card and unlocked the elevator for me. As the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the stainless steel panel. I looked tired, but not shaken. The elevator chimed softly on the 6th floor. When the doors opened, the office lights were dimmed except for the main conference room where a few monitors were still glowing. The glass walls reflected rows of desks, quiet servers, and the low blue light of equipment that had been running all night. 3 years ago, this floor had been empty. Now it held 22 employees, most of them remote. But this was still the headquarters. My headquarters. I rolled my suitcase past the reception desk and into my office. The door still had the same small nameplate it had since the beginning. Hey, Ashraf, director. I dropped my purse on the desk and sat down slowly. The silence felt different here. Controlled. Productive. Safe. I opened my laptop. 32 unread emails. 2 contract approvals waiting for signature. 1 message marked urgent from accounting. I clicked that one first. It was from Melissa, our financial controller. Subject: Final transfer confirmation. I opened the attachment. The document displayed 3 completed wire transfers. Large ones. Very large ones. I leaned back in the chair. Good. That meant the timing had worked perfectly. Because 6 months ago, something unexpected had happened. A venture capital group approached us. They had been quietly tracking the data infrastructure we built for several logistics companies. Apparently, our platform solved a scaling problem a lot of larger firms were struggling with. At first, I declined their interest. I wasn't ready to sell. But they came back with something different. A strategic partnership. Partial acquisition. Infrastructure expansion. And after months of negotiations, we finalized the deal. The final paperwork had been signed just 2 days ago, while I was in Seattle. The total valuation of the company after the deal closed was substantial. Substantial enough that the numbers almost looked fictional when written on paper. But more importantly, it changed something fundamental about my financial structure. Everything had been moved, reorganized, secured. Which meant when Ethan decided to change the locks tonight, he had done it at the worst possible moment for himself. My phone buzzed on the desk. Unknown number. I answered. Hello. Amelia? It was Melissa. Her voice sounded slightly cautious. I saw the timestamp on your login. Are you back already? Just got in. There was a pause. Everything okay? I glanced at the office around me. Mostly. Did the transfer confirmations go through? Yes. All 3. Yep. I smiled faintly. Good. Another pause. Something else happened tonight, I added. Oh. My husband locked me out of our house. The silence on the line stretched for a few seconds. Seriously? Changed the locks while I was away. Melissa exhaled slowly. Well, that's bold. Very. She hesitated before asking the obvious question. Does he know? No. And the house? The deed is technically in his name. I could practically hear the mental calculations happening in her head. Then she asked the question that mattered. The rest of the assets are still protected though, right? I turned slightly in my chair and looked through the glass wall toward the server room. Yes, I said calmly. Everything. Melissa let out a small laugh. Well then. What? If he thinks locking you out of a house is leverage. Her voice trailed off. I finished the sentence quietly. He's about to learn what leverage actually looks like. We ended the call a few minutes later. I stayed at the office until almost 2 in the morning, reviewing documents and responding to emails. Work had always helped me think clearly. By the time I finally shut down the laptop, my next steps were already organized. Not emotionally. Strategically. Because Ethan believed tomorrow would be a simple conversation. He believed I would show up, ask for my belongings, maybe cry, maybe argue. He expected a negotiation where he held the stronger position. But tomorrow wasn't going to be a private conversation. Not anymore. Because Ethan had also forgotten something else. Next Saturday was his company's annual regional leadership dinner. The one he had been talking about for months. 200 managers. Executives flying in. Awards. Announcements. And one special presentation he had been extremely proud of. Ethan believed that dinner would be the highlight of his career this year. What he didn't realize was that by the time that event started, everyone in that room would be looking at him very differently. And the first person to understand why would be Ethan himself. Right in the middle of the room. Saturday arrived faster than Ethan expected. And much slower than I did. By the time the evening of the regional leadership dinner finally came, everything had already been set in motion. Quietly. Carefully. The venue was a hotel ballroom downtown. One of those corporate spaces designed to look impressive without being memorable. Tall ceilings, neutral carpeting, round tables with white cloths and identical centerpieces. I arrived 20 minutes early. Not through the main entrance. Through the side corridor that connected to the hotel's conference offices. The event coordinator greeted me with a professional smile. Ms. Ashraf. Yes. Your equipment is already connected. Perfect. She led me into the ballroom. About half the tables were already filled with managers and executives in suits. Soft jazz music played through ceiling speakers while waiters moved between tables with trays of drinks. No one paid attention to me. Just another early arrival. At the front of the room stood a large projector screen and a small stage with a podium. Behind it, a technician adjusted the laptop connected to the presentation system. Are you the additional presenter? He asked. Something like that. I handed him the flash drive. He plugged it in and opened the file. A simple folder appeared. 3 documents. 2 videos. 1 presentation file. He glanced at the screen. All set. Thank you. I took a seat at the back of the room. From there, I could watch the entrance. 10 minutes later, Ethan walked in. He looked confident. That same relaxed confidence he had on the porch the night he locked the door. He was wearing a navy suit I bought him 2 years ago. He laughed with a group of coworkers as they entered, shaking hands, patting backs. His posture carried the quiet pride of someone expecting recognition tonight. Because he was. Ethan had been nominated for Regional Operations Excellence. A promotion announcement was rumored to follow. He spotted me about 5 minutes later. The moment his eyes landed on me, his smile disappeared. Confusion crossed his face first. Then irritation. He excused himself from his coworkers and walked across the room. Amelia. His voice was tight. What are you doing here? I looked up calmly. Good evening, Ethan. This isn't funny. I agree. He glanced around nervously. Did you follow me here? No. Then how did you even know about this event? I tilted my head slightly. You've been talking about it for months. His jaw tightened. Look, if this is about the house, we can deal with that tomorrow. I'm not here about the house. That seemed to confuse him even more. Then why are you here? Before I could answer, the microphone on stage crackled. A woman stepped up to the podium. Good evening, everyone. If you could begin taking your seats, we'll start the program. Ethan lowered his voice. You need to leave. I didn't move. Sit down, Ethan. His eyes hardened. Don't make a scene. I held his gaze calmly. I won't. For a long moment, he stood there deciding what to do. Finally, he muttered under his breath and returned to his table. The program began. Awards for sales performance. Recognition for logistics efficiency. Short speeches. Applause. Dinner was served halfway through. Ethan barely looked at his food. He kept glancing toward the back of the room where I sat quietly, hands folded, waiting. Then the moment he had been anticipating finally arrived. The host returned to the podium. And now we come to our Regional Operations Excellence Recognition. Ethan straightened slightly in his chair. His coworkers clapped him on the back. The host continued. This award celebrates leadership, financial responsibility, and operational integrity within our management teams. The projector screen lit up behind her. However, she added carefully, before we proceed with the recognition tonight, there is a matter that has recently been brought to the company's attention. Murmurs rippled across the room. Ethan frowned. The host gestured to the technician. Ms. Ashraf, if you would join us. 200 heads turned toward the back of the room. Ethan's face went pale. I stood up. The walk to the stage felt strangely quiet. Not dramatic. Just inevitable. I stepped up to the podium and connected the presentation. The first slide appeared on the screen. A property record document. Highlighted. Address clearly visible. Our house. A few people in the audience leaned forward. I spoke calmly into the microphone. 3 days ago, while I was away on a business trip, my husband Ethan changed the locks on our shared home and informed me via text that it was no longer my residence. A wave of confused whispers spread across the room. Ethan stood up abruptly. What the hell is this? I didn't raise my voice. I simply clicked to the next slide. A financial timeline appeared. Bank statements. Transfer records. Highlighted deposits. Over the past 5 years, I continued calmly, the mortgage payments on that property have been made exclusively from one source. Another click. My company's account name filled the screen. Ethan froze. Although the deed lists Ethan as the owner, I said evenly, the funds used to purchase, renovate, and maintain the property came from my corporate income. Someone in the audience muttered, Wait, what? Ethan's voice cut through the room. You're twisting things. I remained quiet for a moment. Then I clicked again. The first video began playing. It was security footage. From our own front porch. Timestamped. The night he changed the locks. His voice clearly audible through the door camera. You need to leave. This isn't your house anymore. Gasps spread across the ballroom. Ethan looked around the room, realizing too late what was happening. And the worst part for him was that this was only the beginning of what everyone in that room was about to learn. For a few seconds after the video ended, the entire ballroom was silent. Not the polite kind of silence you hear during speeches. This one felt heavy. 200 people staring at a screen that had just played a private moment none of them expected to witness. The final frame of the footage froze on Ethan's face as he shut the door. Then the room slowly filled with quiet murmurs. Chairs shifted. Someone near the front whispered, Is that really him? Ethan was still standing beside his table. His face had gone completely pale. This is insane, he said loudly, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle. She's twisting a personal argument into some kind of public stunt. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I clicked to the next slide. A legal document appeared. Highlighted paragraphs. Dates. Signatures. This, I said calmly, is the operating agreement for my company. The audience shifted again. Some people leaned closer to the screen. 5 years ago, when Ethan and I purchased our home, I was still operating as an independent consultant. Within 6 months of that purchase, I registered a corporation to manage my expanding client contracts. I paused briefly. The company's income funded every mortgage payment on that property. Ethan shook his head. That doesn't mean anything. Plenty of couples use shared money. True, I replied evenly. So, let's be specific. Another click. A spreadsheet appeared. Monthly payment records. Mortgage transfers. Property tax payments. Insurance. Maintenance expenses. Every single one marked with the same source account. My company. Over the past 60 months, I continued, the total amount transferred toward that property is $412,600. The number hung in the air. People in the audience started glancing at each other. Even the executives at the front table were whispering now. Ethan's voice rose. So what? We're married. That's normal. I nodded. Usually. Another click. A second document appeared. Highlighted in yellow. This one had a different header. Property use agreement. Internal corporate asset policy. A few people in the audience frowned, trying to understand what they were looking at. I explained calmly. When my consulting firm transitioned into a corporation 3 years ago, several of my long-term contracts required executive housing availability for visiting partners. I paused deliberately. So the company established a housing asset program. Ethan blinked. What are you talking about? I didn't look at him. The property at 214 Westbrook Drive was registered under that program as an executive residential asset used for client hosting and remote executive work periods. The room went very quiet again, because suddenly the implication was becoming clearer. Someone near the front whispered, "Wait, the house belongs to her company?" I answered before anyone else could. Yes. Ethan laughed sharply. That's ridiculous. The deed is in my name. Yes, I agreed calmly. That part was never changed. I clicked again. Another legal page appeared. Highlighted section. Corporate reimbursement structure. Residential asset acquisition. However, I continued, the property purchase was reimbursed through corporate capital distribution agreements tied to my ownership stake. The executives at the front table were no longer whispering. They were reading carefully. Because the implication was very clear now. The company had funded the asset, maintained the asset, paid every expense attached to the asset, which meant Ethan's claim of control was about to collapse. He looked around the room desperately. This is a private matter, he snapped toward the executives. She has no right bringing this here. One of the senior directors stood slowly. His expression wasn't angry, just deeply concerned. Mr. Carter, he said carefully, the concern here isn't the marital dispute. Ethan turned toward him. Then what is it? The director folded his hands. It's the behavior shown in that video. A few people nodded subtly. He continued. Our management code of conduct includes ethical responsibility in personal dealings, especially those involving financial integrity and potential coercion. Ethan's voice cracked slightly. This has nothing to do with my job. I finally looked directly at him. Actually, I said quietly, it does. I clicked the final slide. 3 financial transfer confirmations filled the screen. Large numbers. Corporate acquisition totals. New ownership structures. A partnership agreement header at the top. The director squinted at the screen. What exactly is this? I answered calmly. 2 days ago, my company finalized a strategic acquisition partnership. Another pause. The company valuation following that agreement is $68 million. A wave of stunned silence spread across the ballroom. Ethan's mouth opened slightly. But more importantly, I added softly, the corporate asset program is currently undergoing review. I gestured lightly toward the frozen property document, still visible on the side screen. And since the house Ethan locked me out of is technically listed under that asset structure. The implication landed like a quiet explosion in the room. I finished the sentence gently. The legal department will be deciding very soon whether he actually has the authority to live there at all. Ethan stared at me like he had never seen me before. Because in that moment, The confident man who had locked the door 3 nights ago finally understood something. He had believed he was forcing me out. But what he had actually done was lock himself into a situation he had absolutely no control over anymore.